How many of you have been watching the news, reading the papers, listening to podcasts, watching the events unfolding on the global stage outside the window and wondering, what the fuck is going on? How is it that everything that we've come to count on, the relative stability that we've enjoyed all of our careers, is now being shaken so fundamentally? And is it being shaken thoughtlessly? So many things that we've said for such a long time are so important to us, whether that's making progress on social issues, whether it's sustainability, countering the worst effects of climate change, bringing diversity into our workplaces and into our societies. We thought we'd try to answer some of this with a new podcast. We thought the world needs more podcasts. You'll be surprised to hear that, I'm sure. The podcast is going to be called What the Fuck Now? And the idea is that we engage in live discussion with a range of interesting thinkers. Not the typical folks you see on TED or on the news, but folks who think deeply about these issues, but we perhaps hear from less often. We'll mix it up with them live, try to answer questions, engage in dialogue, also with people that we might not necessarily agree with. We hope that this is useful for Nordic and European business leaders who are looking at the outside world, thinking maybe about what their companies have been doing for quite some time and wondering, what the fuck now? So join us. We'll be engaging on a range of topics. This first one is going to be focused on the energy transition, but expect others coming very soon. Thank you. Jan, thanks so much for joining us today on our inaugural version of What the Fuck Now? I've got a version of your bio on the screen here, which is impressive. So I'm going to go just over a couple of the high points, including congratulating you on your new role that is starting very imminently, right, as the incoming leader of the energy program at the Environmental Change Institute and Jackson Senior Research Fellow at Oriel College at Oxford. I was having coffee with a friend who works in the energy industry a couple of days ago, and I mentioned the Regulatory Assistance Project, and he said that organization is so important. You spent about 10 years there contributing to all kinds of different energy transition policy questions. And you've done a whole bunch of other things on energy policy, efficiency, electrification, advising government organizations, WEF. So you're prolific in the energy transition space. You're a little bit of a heat pump geek, which make more sense as we get into this a little bit for folks. And yeah, we're super excited. So with that, welcome.
Thanks, Rick. Looking forward to the conversation. So I guess you're right. We could tackle this podcast theme from so many different angles, given what's happening in pretty much real time as we have this conversation in the energy space. So fascinating times to talk about the energy transition, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's coolest about it, I mean, you've been in this space for years, as have I. If we'd been having this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, we'd be sitting here hoping that some things would be true. The difference today is that very suddenly, I'd say over maybe the last 36 months, we have the data in on very many different topics. So we're not surmising or hoping or whatever it was that we were doing 15 years ago when we were trying to get things moving. Now we're at a different spot. And it's almost like day to day. What was it last week? BYD said, oh, we can do 1,000 volt architecture in electric vehicles. And then today, Zeekr says, what was it? 1,200 volt charging? Unbelievable.
It's incredible, right? I mean, it's even faster. And I mean, I remember well, just about 10 years ago when there weren't really very many models at all on the market. I mean, you had maybe the Nissan Leaf, the Renault Zoe, I think was there in the more affordable car category. And then you had the Model S. And yeah, there were a few others, but there weren't that many. And now we're seeing new models coming out all the time in this race to getting more range, faster charging. And I think it's just the beginning of it. It's really exciting. And I feel like that race has firmly been won now, unlike in some of the other technologies where it's still unclear which technology will prevail. But with personal road transportation, EVs are clearly winning the race and have won the race hands down.
This is happening, and we wanted to start off with the energy transition If you told me 15 years ago I'd be sitting here talking about energy, I'd have told you you were high, because energy is not a very interesting thing, but I've learned better since.
It might be useful to actually start with a diagram to talk you through it, because I find it useful to think about this in numeric terms and numbers, and where does the energy come from? Where is it being used? How's it being converted? And what is the efficiency of that? And there's a great resource that I want to point the listeners to, and it's from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And I checked this morning and it's still up. Who knows for how long? Some of that information around energy has been pulled recently from US websites, but this one is still live. It's called flowcharts. .lnl.gov commodities/energy, and you can find these Sankey diagrams for almost every single country, I think, in the world. There's a lot of different countries. Some of it is out of date, but a lot of it is fairly recent. And I'm just going to show you one chart for the US because that's quite recent. Yeah, this is a classic Sankey diagram in many regards. The first Sankey diagram was produced by, I think, a Brit who was called Captain Sankey, and he wanted to figure out the efficiency of steam engines to, I think, optimize steam engines to make sure you get more mileage out of it. I think this was in the context of shipping. So he came up with the first Sankey diagram, really showing the energy inputs on the left-hand side. And then you see different conversion stages in the middle, and on the right-hand side, the energy use. And that's what you can see here too. The data is actually pretty recent, October 2024. It's for 2023. And you see here in primary energy terms on the left, all the energy inputs for the US energy system. It's not just electricity, it's everything. We're talking about transportation, industry, buildings. And then you see on the right-hand side in pink, the end-use sectors: residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation. And you also see electricity generation being pulled out here in orange in the middle. But what's remarkable about this Sankey diagram is that it shows the amount of useful energy that ends up in energy services, by which I mean things like mobility, actually driving the car, or heating a building, or using an appliance like a hairdryer. And then you see in light gray in the bottom right corner the amount of rejected energy, and that's all the energy waste. And it's basically waste heat. And to give you an example why we see such a big amount of waste heat, so one is power generation. If you have a power station, you might be having an efficiency of maybe 40% at best, probably a bit less. The other 60% plus ends up as waste heat. Or if you look at the internal combustion engine, it's even worse. An average ICE vehicle has an efficiency of maybe 20%. And the other 80% again ends up as just waste heat. So that's what this diagram is depicting. It's summarizing all of that waste heat in that light gray box here, and it's then pulling out all the useful energy in the dark gray box in the bottom right of this diagram. So that's I think a useful starting point to think about the energy transition, rather than thinking of, oh, we got to replace all that stuff on the left here, and that's going to be really hard, if not impossible, and therefore we should never even entertain the thought of any transition away from molecules and fossil fuels.
That industry has been brilliant because they have figured out how to charge by volume, charge by barrel or by BCM or by ton of coal, right? Not by what the customer receives and is able to use on the bottom right. So, and I've been challenging myself, and I've been asking others too in conversation, name another product on the planet where you get to pay 100% but only benefit 34%. It's a really stark thing, right? And if you want to be provocative, which I think is sometimes useful when you talk about stuff like this, you could say, isn't that in effect an enormous wealth transfer? We're charging the average citizen who's, maybe working a blue collar job and trying to fill up a pickup truck in Texas with fuel, and only giving them a small fraction of what the benefit is. If we were sitting here talking about this 30 years ago, it might not have been that important, this point that we're making, because there weren't many alternatives. But as we said at the outset of the call, over the past 3 years or so, there's been a little bit of an inflection point, and suddenly lots of things are possible that were not before. And then this tremendous inefficiency in the big energy system becomes extremely interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, there's actually an opportunity here, right? When you look at the amount of inefficiency, you can look at this in two ways. One is to say, oh, we just got to put up with that, but that's just the way things work. And I get comments like that all the time on social media where people say, well, what's the problem here? It's quite natural that you get these conversion inefficiencies, and it's still cheaper than alternatives. But it presents a tremendous opportunity. And let me just give you a couple of, I think, really good examples of what those look like. We talked about EVs right at the beginning of our conversation, and an EV is perhaps 3 or even 4 times more efficient than an internal combustion engine vehicle. And if that electricity then comes from renewables, you basically avoid a lot of the inefficiencies that are associated with a petrol or diesel vehicle. So you're getting that significant efficiency bonus. And that's why we're seeing people actually saving money who own EVs, even though per unit of energy, electricity is often more expensive. But those efficiencies offset that. And the same goes in many countries for heat pumps. So heat pumps will deliver perhaps 4 units of heat for 1 unit of electricity input because they're harvesting heat that's already there, ambient heat or maybe waste heat. They compress it and transport it to where it's needed, rather than just creating heat by combusting a fuel. And again, those efficiency differences are vast. If you think about those boxes on the right, actually the amount of energy you need for heating buildings is suddenly a quarter of what was needed before. And that creates significant overall system benefits, savings. And of course, reduces carbon emissions as well, because you need a lot less energy, even if the electricity that you're using comes from fossil fuels, from gas plants. I mean, it's not intuitive, because you might think, well, actually converting gas to electricity and then using it in heat pumps or EVs, that must be worse. But it's not, because the efficiency of the end use application is so much better. And therefore, I think it's a good entry point to talk about the opportunities for innovation. And when you apply the full potential of these improvements to the entire world economy, you can see savings of perhaps as much as 40%, maybe even 50%, just by electrification of end-use sectors, let alone avoiding some of the other inefficiencies that are also part and parcel of our current energy system. Poorly insulated buildings. Like I live in the UK, where that's pretty common. Badly managed industrial processes, which is another. In a lot of countries, there's lots of potential to have much better managed energy processes in industry and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity to reduce the overall need for energy inputs on the left-hand side.
Right. And then there's another example that I've just been fascinated by as I've read about it. We need to dramatically decrease the emissions from the global shipping industry. Well, what if we're moving 60% of the oil and gas and coal around the world that we don't need to actually move because it just gets wasted as heat in the combustion process anyway? Right. So, I mean, you could use a simple example just to think about it. What if I asked you to carry 100 liters of water up a big hill, and then when you got to the top of it, I asked you to pour 64 liters out on the ground. That like logistical reality is happening all over the world every day, and it's happening on ships, and it's happening in trucks and on trains, and so we're moving a tremendous amount of physical, heavy, reasonably dense material all over the planet every day, and then wasting most of it. We're pouring most of it out on the ground. We're actually wasting it as heat, where 64% of it is resulting in climate emissions that we don't need, and also local pollution. So there's all kinds of really interesting inefficiencies that should motivate tremendous transformation, should encourage us because it represents an opportunity to save a lot of money. And some of these new alternatives, as we're seeing with cars from China and many other things, represent amazing innovation opportunities too, because we get to scrap some of these complex mechanical linkages that have also been parts of these. So we're not going to take completely off here, Jan, but I think that this is Al Gore made that movie years ago called Inconvenient Truth. And I would say that this particular chart, in a way, is the real inconvenient truth for society. Your average person, and I'd be curious to have your view on this, why you think this is so. Your average person, I've been talking to pretty senior and seasoned business executives and using this chart over the past 8 to 12 weeks. And I would say 90% of them are not aware of this fact, right? And those are seasoned, experienced, right? Some in the sustainability field, some in others. 90% not aware. The average person is completely protected from this insight. Do you have any views on why that could be?
Yeah, before I go into that, just quickly on shipping, which is another fact that a lot of people don't know. And I think the figure is that about 40% of all shipping activity is related to transporting fossil fuels or fossil fuel derivatives. So there again, you have the inefficiency of the ships themselves, but also the actual activity itself might become obsolete, if we transition away from using molecules in a significant fashion. Again, those facts are not widely known and astonishing when you hear them the first time. It's hard to believe, but those are pretty credible numbers. Why do so few people know about it? It's interesting. Even when I talk to people who are energy experts, they often sort of stop their models at the end use stage. So they might look at how much energy goes into the building sector, the industry sector, the transport sector, but they might not model often, well, what is the conversion efficiency of those fuels in the end use stage, and therefore how much energy is wasted. It's often not being called out explicitly, and most Sankeys actually stop at the sector stage. They don't really pull out the waste energy very well. So that's one reason it's not been done very well in the past in terms of analysis. And this is something I'm working on right now with some colleagues to try to provide a global Sankey diagram in a similar fashion to the one that we looked at a few minutes ago, to really demonstrate the inefficiency of the current system, but then also to model a kind of alternative world where we try to maximize efficiency and what that looks like, and then contrast that and compare it. I think the other reason why people maybe don't want to look into this in great detail is because it's quite convenient to believe that the current approach is irreplaceable. It's working. There's an existing business model. I recently spoke to more than 200 oil and gas executives, and I got a very strong sense in the Q&A and also in at the reception afterwards, that people were really still believing very much that it's going to be business as usual, right? Things are not really going to change. There's still perhaps even growth possible in the sector. So the message, I think, that demand reduction and improving efficiency hasn't arrived, certainly not in the sector where it needs to arrive. I mean, there are some companies that are moving forward. There's some really progressive companies now out there trying to diversify their activities because they recognize that. But I would say the vast majority have not fully grasped this yet. And then finally, I think we talked about EVs and heat pumps. Some of these technologies are still pretty new in the sense that they are now being scaled. I mean, they existed for a long time. Some of the first cars were electric, and not many people know that. Taxis in New York in the late 19th century were electric, and then the internal combustion engine just became better and better and essentially crowded out EVs. Heat pumps were invented in the 19th century, so they're not new technologies, but what is new is that they have been scaled now and they've become so good that they can compete. And that is only relatively recent that we're seeing that, perhaps in the last 20 years, 15 years or so, that we're seeing those new technologies make inroads and have now gotten to a place where they can beat fossil fuels.
Yeah, which is fascinating, right? And I think I find that that modeling point that you made really interesting, right? And I wonder if that sort of comes down to the fact that when you don't have compelling alternatives, there's maybe not that much use in going further, right? So you'll have to help me here, but that might equate like going halfway or 2/3 of the way out on that Sankey diagram that you showed, but not going all the way. So we're here now, where many new solutions exist. They're being produced by proper companies at scale, turning down cost curves for a considerable amount of time. And I was also reminded by an engineer that I was talking to the other day that this shouldn't be a surprise for anybody. It's the second law of thermodynamics. Everybody learned it in school. There's an old quote that says something to the effect that it's hard to get somebody to acknowledge a truth. When your salary depends on it, I think is the way that it ends. I didn't get the beginning right, but anyway. The next topic that we wanted to get into, and this one is very present. It's a very now sort of issue, right? It's in the papers in the UK, definitely in many European countries, certainly here in Norway, also in the US. And that has to do with the fact that renewable energies, like the investments in renewables that have been happening, have been making our electricity so damn expensive, or at least that's the claim. So that's the next topic that we want to investigate together.
So, yeah, I've seen those claims, and I think it's important to look at this historically. When did prices really start to increase, and what's driving those price increases? So it is true that historically renewables have received quite a lot of support, subsidies paid through a surcharge on people's electricity bill. Perhaps the most prominent example of that being the German feed-in tariff scheme, or the EEG, which has provided tremendous support and actually led to the scaling up of the solar industry in China in part. German consumers have paid for ramping up the global solar industry by doing that. Until recently, that was a significant surcharge on German electricity prices. It's no more because it's now paid by the public budget in Germany rather than energy bills. So there's an element of that. But what people really refer to, I think, in those newspaper headlines or on social media are those more recent price spikes, what we saw in the last 2 or 3 years. That, I'm afraid, has little to do with renewables, but is primarily, not only, but primarily driven by the rising gas price. And why are gas prices so high in Europe? Well, it has to do with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022. And already before that, we could see, I think starting in sort of August, September, that there was a throttling of the amount of piped gas from Russia to Europe, and prices started to rise. And then after 2020 in February, prices went up really sharply, and wholesale gas prices were at some point more than 10 times as high as they used to be before the invasion of Ukraine. And why is that important? Well, it is important because in a lot of countries, gas sets the price in the electricity market. The marginal generator, the last generator that is being asked to generate in the market is often the gas generator because it's most expensive. And that leads to higher electricity prices that are then being passed on to consumers. So that is the primary reason. It's not just me saying that. The likes of the International Energy Agency or the Association of European Energy Regulators have looked at this in great detail and found that to be the primary factor driving electricity prices across Europe. And yes, it is also true that there are costs of integrating a large share of renewables into the electricity system. We will have to build out the grid. That comes at a cost. We need storage, both short-term and long-term storage. There are significant costs associated with this transition. We shouldn't shy away from that. But it is not the case that the most recent rises in electricity bills are to do primarily with that. They really have to do with gas prices. And I encourage listeners who are skeptical of that, just look at how closely gas and electricity prices are correlated. There was a recent graphic for the UK depicting that very nicely. I think Simon Evans produced that from Carbon Brief, where you can see that electricity prices basically follow gas prices almost 100%. So that is the primary driver. And then the question is, why do we see those arguments being made in the media, on social media? Well, I would say it's often deliberate. These arguments are not made in good faith, but they're made in order to rubbish renewables and clean energy and to prolong the lifetime of fossil fuel generators, which is clearly not in the public interests, but it is causing an awful lot of confusion, and that's not helpful.
Right. Oh, thank you. So then you would say the fact that we don't yet have enough renewable power generation and storage solutions means that basically the system falls short and gas-powered generation needs to be switched on. And therefore, not at all times, but at those times, gas sets the price. Am I right in saying it that way? So you could have 20 hours where the sun and the wind and some limited amount of storage, which is small but it's growing, manages to cover the whole usage, and the price is determined amongst them, whatever the most expensive of those sources is. But then at 7 p.m., when everybody gets home and starts doing laundry and turning on the dishwasher, and that is no longer enough or is expended, and the next source is required, which in this case might be gas, then that sets the price for that period. Is that inaccurate?
That's correct. And in some countries, the number of hours when gas sets the price is quite limited. In the UK, it's at the extreme. The UK is the country with the highest percentage of hours in the year where gas sets the price. There's other countries. Norway is a good example, actually, on the other end of the spectrum, where that's not the case. There's huge diversity. But in those countries that have seen the highest electricity price spikes, well, what you also find is those are not the countries with the highest share of renewables. In fact, those are the countries with the highest share of gas generation and the largest number of hours in a year where gas sets the price. So that's the key explanatory driver here for rising electricity prices. And I mean, you could extend the argument a little further. And sometimes I hear people say, well, but if you have renewables, you need 100% backup, and that requires to have all these idle gas plants. But the main cost of gas power plants is not capex. It's actually opex. It's the gas that you burn in the power plant. And that's why you only use them as the last generator usually, because they are pretty cheap to build, but they're expensive to operate. So that really doesn't hold that argument. The main reason is the price of the commodity of gas that is now imported from new places in Europe, LNG from the US, for example, and that drives up prices in wholesale markets.
I wonder, Jan, just sort of a side question that's related to what you said. You mentioned CapEx and OpEx. Could you just say a few words about the differences between how gas power generation, for example, works, CapEx and OpEx? You just did, but just remind us. And then compare that to a solar farm or a wind farm.
I mean, the main difference is that, let's start with solar, right? You buy a solar panel and stick it on your roof. The only cost associated with that is the installation. You have to buy the solar panel, you have to pay an installer to install it, connect it up, and once it's there, I mean, maintenance is next to zero. I mean, unless you factor in a bit of cleaning once in a while of your panels. But if nothing goes wrong, and often nothing goes wrong, you can just assume that it's going to be zero cost or close to zero cost. So in other words, once you made an investment to produce another kilowatt hour of electricity, it's zero marginal cost or close to zero marginal cost. And the same goes for other forms of renewables. You have high capex, but close to zero opex, some maintenance cost, of course. With the gas plant, it's kind of the other way around. You pay a relatively modest amount to build the gas plant, and then you have a continuous expense, which is your opex, the fuel to keep generating electricity from your gas plant, and that really makes up the vast majority of your overall cost. So completely different cost structure, kind of an inversion of what we talked about when it comes to solar panels and most other renewables. So that explains, I think, some of the confusion in this debate, where people kind of point to the high cost of installing renewables, but ignore that once you have installed them, the cost of producing electricity is pretty low, maybe zero, unless you factor in things like storage. But we didn't really talk about batteries. Even if you factor in batteries, there's a paper in Nature that came out, I think, a year and a half ago or so, looking at what is going to be the cheapest form of generating electricity and requiring storage for intermittent renewables. And the paper found that it's going to be solar in the vast majority of places by 2030, because batteries and solar just become cheaper and cheaper. And even if you have to build them together, you have 100% backup with a battery, you will find that solar is just cheaper than all of the other technologies that are available today.
Which is amazing, right? I mean, I'm sitting at 59 degrees north here in Oslo, Norway, and we're having this conversation based on power coming out of some batteries in the basement. And one of the things that's been shocking for me is that I'm trying to think here, 4 to 5 months out of the year here in Norway, this far north, which for folks in the States, we're at the same level as Anchorage, Alaska, basically. There's not much sun. But the other 7.5, 8 months of the year, starting in the middle of February, the sun is by far the dominant generator, making living in a place like this on solar and battery power possible. So that was even surprising to me. I didn't expect it to be that effective so early in the year. There's also been a lot of discussion and a lot of movement in the market over the past couple of years, right? There was a bit of a here comes everybody investing in renewable power generation. I'm including some of the fossil producers, and then many stopping up and saying, this isn't a very good business. And one of the reasons that they're saying it's not a good business is because unlike the oil industry or the gas industry, where you get to sell volumes every day, regardless of how much benefit there is to the consumer, with these new sources, the sun and the wind provides the energy every day once the investment is made. So it's a real shift in the logic of how this whole thing works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the countries we should probably talk about in this context is China. I mentioned China before, I think, when I talked about the solar industry, but China is yet another, I think, interesting topic in terms of social media conversations and some of the media coverage. Perhaps we spend a bit more time on that in the remaining time we have. Rake, what do you think?
The first question that I have on China for you is, why are they so interested in renewable power generation? Why are they so interested in this industry?
I think there are several reasons. I mean, one is that China doesn't have the same kind of resources that other countries have when it comes to oil and gas in particular. So it's a net importer, and strategically being able to produce renewable electricity and also to become an exporter when it comes to renewable energy technologies and other clean energy technologies. Yeah, it's an economic choice, and the Chinese government has prioritized this for many years now, early on. I think the other reason why we're seeing such a focus on that in China is that they have used their domestic market to really scale and innovate and drive down costs first, in a way. And then you look at the number of EVs on the road, China is doing pretty well. When you look at the amount of renewable capacity that's being installed in China, it's vast. I mean, it's more of the rest of the world combined. There's some great numbers how much China installed last year. I don't have them in front of me, but it's just a vast difference between China, and then takes a long time until you see the next country on the list in terms of the capacity that's getting installed every year in China. And same goes for electric vehicles and some of the other technologies like batteries. So China is really leading in that way. But of course, China also still builds new coal power plants, and that hasn't really come to an end. In fact, they're still building additional ones. Some of those replace existing coal power plants and are perhaps more efficient, but there's still more net additions in China when it comes to coal. But what we're seeing also, I think, is that this is now seemingly coming to an end, and many have predicted that emissions could already plateau this year, perhaps, or already have plateaued last year. We're going to see that. But it's this kind of funny dual reality in China. Yeah, they're sort of both a top polluter and also a green energy leader. A bit like Norway in a way, right? Where Norway has done so much on EVs and heat pumps, but is still a major exporter of oil and gas. So yeah, some call that hypocritical. I think that it's more complex than that. But China is clearly critical in the energy transition, and now the world really relies on China as the main producer of solar, but even parts of wind turbines, batteries, and increasingly also EVs.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, BYD's journey is absolutely fascinating, right? I believe also owning their own shipping capacity to be able to move their cars all over the world. You know, you started off by mentioning reason number one is really energy independence. They don't want to be beholden to other countries for fossil fuels, since, as you said, they don't produce much of it themselves. And interestingly, the drill baby drill movement in the US was in a way also an energy independence thing, right? The US was not too many years ago an importer as well, and reliant on other sources of fossil fuels. So as the technologies become more compelling, as we ride down these cost curves, these renewable technologies are very likely to be the new energy independence plays. But nobody wants to have a half-powered economy on the road to that destination, right? You've sort of talked a little bit about Energiewende in Germany without using the title, and a similar dynamic happened in Germany, right? Where there was, for a while, increased brown coal consumption after nuclear power generation was turned off as a sort of reaction to Fukushima. But as they go forward and become more and more efficient, the arc of history will show that period of increased coal consumption was relatively short. And with China too, so it'll be interesting to know. We'll know in 2 or 3 years. Did we pass it in 23 or 24 or 25? And then, at what point did the increasing amount of coal generation start to slope off? The fact of the matter is they don't really want to be buying their coal from other countries either, right? So they'll be getting more effective on that as soon as they possibly can. One of the things I think is super interesting about China, Jan, that you didn't mention, or at least maybe did so obliquely, is the fact that they seem to be playing to win in terms of industrial dominance on so many of these technologies, while investors and governments in the West are hesitant and say, we're not sure if we're going to do it if we don't know if we're going to make money on it. And then the degree to which the West becomes then beholden to their dominance. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's certainly a concern if one country dominates the supply chain so much, for a number of reasons. I mean, we've seen with the pandemic, haven't we, that certain components just weren't available anymore for a long time. There were shortages, and then also the geopolitics that we're seeing now, I think, are very worrying in that regard. So having a more diversified supply chain can only be a good thing. What can other countries perhaps do to do that? Well, I think it's easy to start with what we shouldn't be doing, and that is having endless debates about whether renewables or EVs or heat pumps are good technologies, and flip-flopping or talking endlessly about sort of more nonsensical applications for hydrogen, which really do not help providing clarity to investors and driving up demand for these technologies and building a local supply chain. So that is deeply unhelpful, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the US over the next few years and how that is going to pan out. Because, of course, in the long run, having a car industry that produces cars that are fully electric is going to be the key to winning against the competition. And China is, as we talked about BYD, but there's also many other brands, is doing very well on that front, and is really making inroads, eating into the market share of very established car companies in the global north. So that's, I think, part of the answer to your question is we need to see more clarity and strategy, basically doing what the Chinese have done on some of these technologies and really having a clear plan and setting out ambition and then following through on that. I'm worried that we kind of see the opposite of that, where we're going into a very polarized debate now around energy, which then leaves little wiggle room for politicians, for policymakers to come up with bold policies and follow through on those. That is a real worry. Can we replicate the Chinese solar industry in Europe? Like, I highly doubt it. I don't think we can do that. That ship might have sailed a long time ago. But there's other technologies that hasn't happened yet, and where Europe could actually become perhaps a market leader. And that requires leadership. I mean, think about Airbus, right? A pan-European initiative worrying about maybe losing out against the Americans. And it succeeded with all its troubles and problems, but it succeeded. And maybe we need something similar in terms of ambition for energy to build up a more Europe-based supply chain around key technologies. You might think about industrial electrification, large-scale heat pumps, which is something Europe is doing pretty well. Europe has some of the most important manufacturers for large-scale heat pumps used in industry. Yeah, that can be built on. It's not a written rule that everything has to go to China when it comes to clean energy technologies, but it requires that leadership. And right now, I'm afraid in many countries, we're not seeing that. It's absent.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for mentioning Airbus, because that's such a great example. And it's an example of staying the course, right? Being committed to it because of the strategic value of having that capability on the continent rather than not having it. And, there's lots of different components involved in the mixes that we're talking about of these renewable solutions. And I understand that offshore wind producers right now are struggling to get a hold of turbines, and some of the Western manufacturers are wondering if they should still be making turbines, right? But there's security concerns with buying all of our turbines from China as well, right? To be engaged in the solar industry, there's many more valuable components than just panels, which are perhaps the least valuable component in the whole chain, right? So there's many ways to think about this. So I guess one of my hopes is that we in Europe and also in the US managed to adopt a little bit of the thinking that we see in China, which is being long-term about it and being determined to be a player in those spaces over the long term, rather than sort of dabbling and then pulling out because we get unsure of ourselves or we can't see the money, which is what we've seen in the Nordics recently with regard to these battery companies that have been sort of folding up shop and saying we can't do it here. Well, it's a strategic security problem if countries in Europe can't do it here. So therefore, we must find out how to. And getting 30% of the way through a journey, I don't know what the percentage is on some of the examples that we've had so far that have been in the news this last year, but getting some percentage of our way through the journey, consuming lots of subsidies and lots of investors' money, and then quitting, that is just losing. That's really unfortunate. So hopefully, the events of the last 3 or 4 months in the US have been interesting.
I think especially in Europe, you have all these slightly different markets, political systems, regulatory systems, and it's a bit like a policy laboratory. You have all these petri dishes where you're trying out different approaches, and that could be a good thing because it's unlikely that all of Europe at once will move into a rather unhelpful direction when it comes to the energy transition. So perhaps that is a nice way to kind of look ahead, that actually there are opportunities because of the diversity of Europe and the innovation that we're seeing in different places here.
We can hope, right? That must be allowed. We can hope, and then we can work as hard as we possibly can to realize that. So maybe starting to round things off a little bit, is there anything that we've not talked about that you've been thinking about sort of very lately as you've had some breathing space between what you've been doing with RAP over the past 10 years and what you're now going to be doing at Oxford?
Yeah, what I think is a topic that is still underappreciated is what do we do with the legacy infrastructure? And there's not a lot of research on it, not a lot of analysis, not a lot of conversation. That is starting to change. But what I would like to do is to start that conversation more broadly and really think through, not incrementally, but from the back, from where we need to be in a clean energy system. What infrastructure will we still need? What infrastructure will become obsolete? How do we deal with in some parts, decommissioning that infrastructure through a clever regulation? And that is a topic I hope to explore at Oxford and look at some of the places that have started to do this successfully and then share it. Because I think we're going to run into that as we transition away from that, to come back to our early conversation, inefficient energy system of the past to a much more efficient system of the future.
Fascinating. We'll look forward to following in that and learning from you as you explore those avenues, Jan, and also look forward to staying in touch, and then who knows, maybe checking in a couple of years' time and hopefully sharing our pleasure at some of the evolutions that have happened.
I'm sure we will.
But certainly also being able to explore some bumps. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Rick. Pleasure.
You've been listening to WTF Now by S7, hosted by Rick Wheatley. Our guest on this episode was Dr. Jan Rosenow. The episode was produced by S7 and edited by Henrietta Dalby. If you have thoughts on the show or suggestions for future guests, hit us up on LinkedIn or send us an email at WTFnow_podcast@system7.com. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.